Shadow of the Colossus could be described as a minimalist game. Most of the things you'd expect to find in an action-adventure game are missing. There's no combat, no inventory, no NPCs, and very little explicit narrative. Almost everything is stripped away, leaving just 16 puzzle bosses and a vast but empty world. The minimalist approach to Shadow of the Colossus sets it apart from most games, but being different doesn't automatically make something better. It's what it does with its limited content that makes it special. The minimalist design highlights a theme that permeates the game: contrast. Spacing out each Colossus fight between long stretches of relaxed open-world travel enhances the impact and drama of each battle. Each Colossus is arranged so that it contrasts with its neighbors, and the traveling sections in between similarly provide contrasting areas of the world to explore. Even the visual style is all about contrast. The desaturated colors and overexposed lighting draw attention to the contrast between light and shadow. Creative director Fumito Ueda has described his style as design by subtraction, an approach that sacrifices quantity in favor of a focused artistic vision. By limiting themselves to fewer mechanics, the team was able to give each one the attention it deserves, making the gameplay more engaging. By putting less in the world, they were able to focus on atmosphere and pacing, giving the world more character. And with less content in the game as a whole, they were able to arrange what remains in a contrasting and poignant aesthetic, making the overall experience more cohesive. To summarize, Shadow of the Colossus is a game that does more with less. Elden Ring is a game with almost the exact opposite design philosophy. It's maximalist rather than minimalist. Building on the mechanics of the Soulsborne series, it throws in almost everything from the previous games and the kitchen sink into the mix. It's Dark Souls on steroids. Everything is bigger, more complicated, and there's more of it. Boss fights are more spectacular, combat options are more varied, and the world is easily the largest and most detailed FromSoft has ever conceived. In a sense, Elden Ring is a game that does more with more. Given the positive way I described the minimalist design of Shadow of the Colossus, that might sound like a thinly veiled criticism, but it's not. I want to make it clear before I continue that I think Elden Ring is a great game, one of the best to come out in many years. Even though it suffers in some areas, I can appreciate its ambitious vision. In keeping with its new open-world setting, Elden Ring's design is mainly oriented around exploration and player freedom, and a maximalist approach is a logical fit for that theme. In the same way that a tougher challenge brings a greater sense of accomplishment, Elden Ring provides a wonderful sense of adventure that couldn't be achieved without the tremendous size and scope of the world. But despite the advantages of Elden Ring's maximalist design, it sometimes overreaches, especially as the game progresses, leaving the late game areas feeling shallow, stretched out, disconnected, and rushed. Lack of polish in the late game isn't new for FromSoft. Every action RPG they've released has suffered from development crunch time, with late game areas often getting the short end of the stick. But the size of Elden Ring only exacerbates that problem. It's one thing if an area the size of Lost Izalith is unrefined, but when the late game is the size of Lordran itself, a substantial amount of time is spent in subpar levels. Broadly speaking, the journey through Elden Ring is focused on the Erd Tree. As you progress through the game, you'll get closer and closer until you finally arrive at its entrance. It's a monument which orients you throughout the game, both physically and in the narrative. So there's something odd about the fact that when you finally arrive at its base, you walk right past it and up a mountain, where you set it on fire from a distance. Then you fall asleep and wake up in a flying city even further away where you set it more on fire. Then you wake up again back in Lendel where there's nothing left except a boss rush to the end. Theoretically, this change of pace could be a contrasting climax to the game, but it ends up feeling more haphazard, partly because of the disjointed map design. From the moment you set foot in Limgrave, the entire open world from Redmane Castle to Lendel can be traversed in contiguous, uninterrupted gameplay. But after beating Morgott, the map design becomes increasingly fragmented, with almost every late game area only accessible by one entrance with a loading screen or cutscene. Mogwyn Palace and Deeproot Depths have two entrances each, but neither path can be traversed backwards, leaving these areas as disconnected from the open world as Round Table hold. This might be only a minor issue, except that it's accentuated by the severe drop in enemy variety in these areas. Out of the Mountaintops of the Giants, Farum Azula, Consecrated Snowfield, the Halig Tree, the Sewers, Deeproot Depths, and Mogwyn Palace, the only new enemy that hasn't already appeared in some form is the Albinaric Archer, and they're far from the best of what the game has to offer. Unique enemies aren't just a way to shake up the combat, they also provide a unique character to each area. The Mountaintops of the Giants is the most disappointing in this respect. Finding more of the same golems, demi-humans, bats, and skeletons that have been sprinkled copiously throughout the game isn't just disappointing mechanically, but also thematically. It feels shallow. Even worse, it reuses the finger creepers, giant crayfish, and the giant crows and dogs, which had been doing for their respective areas what's missing from the mountaintops, sullying the uniqueness of those locations retroactively. The repetition of enemies is mirrored in the bosses as well. There are 168 boss fights in Elden Ring, but only 13 of these are completely unique, not being reused for another boss fight or standard enemy. Reusing minor bosses or field bosses is a reasonable concession for the size of the map, and can even sometimes help provide a feeling of progression. But repeating major bosses like Mohg and Godric detracts from the unique experience of fighting those characters. Even optional bosses with unique designs, like Astel or the Ancestral Spirit, suffer from repetition. The special novelty of the experience becomes familiar and predictable. The first time you fight a giant dragon, it's very dramatic, but by the 30th time, it starts to lose some of its luster. FromSoft might have had more time to create unique boss fights if they weren't so obsessed with making each one as long and complicated as possible. Ever since the DLC to Dark Souls 1, the series has increasingly leaned on the action elements of its boss fights, giving bosses more and more unique moves and combos. But quantity isn't the same thing as depth. More attack animations doesn't translate to more complex gameplay if the strategy for each attack is the same. Learn the timing of the animation, dodge at the right moment, and attack when you have an opening. Dark Souls created an atmosphere of anxiety around many of its boss fights, and it punished players who succumbed to that effect. Panicking would usually get you killed, but if you kept a cool head, paid attention, and thought strategically, the boss would be easily defeated. Dark Souls primarily challenged players psychologically, but the barrier to victory in the successive titles has increasingly relied on rote memorization and Twitch gameplay. Neither of those things require much deep thought or planning from the player. Memorization doesn't test intelligence or observation, but rather your ability to repeatedly bang your head against the wall. To shake this up, Elden Ring's enemies can now change attacks in the middle of a combo, but if anything this makes the gameplay even more shallow. It encourages a style of play that's less strategic and more reaction-based. Twitch gameplay is filled with more adrenaline, but whatever extra tension this adds has been counteracted by the simultaneous trend in boss fights towards becoming bloated battles of attrition. The awesome spectacle of these fights can't hide the fact that in terms of gameplay, most bosses are little more than dressed-up bullet sponges that overstay their welcome, and that bloat only becomes more pronounced with the excessive repetition of boss fights. Repetition of enemies and bosses might be more palatable if they were all polished and well designed, but the game seems to almost deliberately choose to repeat its worst enemies the most. Rune bears are one of the most embarrassingly broken enemies that FromSoft has ever designed, but they're still placed in almost every area of the game. Ulcerated tree spirits cause flashbacks to the incomprehensible visual design and animations of Bloodborne's worst enemies. The way they constantly clip through every surface at least means that more of that visual mess is hidden, but despite the issue with clipping, 5 of them are placed in small stone rooms, as if to make absolutely sure any sense of believability is gone. Other questionable enemy designs include the Deathbirds, Red Wolves, Gargoyles, Bloodhound Knights, Banished Knights, Pages, Falling Star Beasts, Godskin Nobles, Revenants, Grafted Scions, Ancestral Follower Archers, and Bell-Bearing Hunters, all of which the game can't seem to get enough of. Broadly speaking, these enemies are all characterized by unintuitive ways of moving, badly telegraphed attack animations, constant aggression, and abrupt poise-breaking attacks that deal massive damage. If that weren't bad enough, repeat bosses are often given a friend to shake up the format. If you didn't enjoy fighting one ulcerated tree spirit, maybe you'd enjoy fighting 3. If one Crystallian was boring, why not add a couple and give them all the ability to inflict rot? If a single watchdog is too easy, why not add 4 or 5 imps to stagger you, in a setup eerily reminiscent of Dark Souls 2 spam bushes? In almost all cases, the mild disappointment of simple repetition would have been preferable to this lazy attempt at adding surface-level variety. Maybe I'm being a little harsh. Elden Ring is a really big game, and most players probably aren't going to explore every single nook and cranny, especially on a first playthrough. You could try and defend the repetition of bosses by arguing that it gives most players a chance to experience these encounters regardless of where their path through the game takes them. But this would be a shift in FromSoft's design philosophy from previous games. The Soulsborne games have never been afraid to hide things where only exceptionally thorough players will find them, but that curiosity is generally rewarded with a unique experience. The smaller scale of Demon Souls or Dark Souls made exploring every nook and cranny feasible, but also fulfilling, and the same can't be said equally of Elden Ring. As the game progresses, diversions off the critical path become less and less attractive, because you already know what to expect. Another cave or catacomb with the same enemies, the same bosses, the same layout, and the same treasure. The late game seems almost intentionally designed to tell players, stop exploring so much and just finish the damn game already. This gets to the heart of Elden Ring's biggest problem with the design of its open world. Exploring a little is extremely rewarding, but exploring too much often diminishes what you've already experienced. It's pretty easy for me to sit back and criticize a game as massive and ambitious as Elden Ring for its lack of variety, and much harder to actually solve that problem. To create a single enemy, it has to have a model and animations, hitboxes, textures, sound effects, AI, and when everything's done, it has to be thoroughly tested for balance and to make sure there are no bugs. A lot of work goes into every detail of a game like this. No matter how much a game has, it's always possible to ask for more, but many of Elden Ring's issues could be improved just as easily by subtraction as they could by addition. Imagine if, instead of being filled with repeat appearances of the giant crows and dogs and finger creepers, the mountaintops had no enemies whatsoever. On the surface, this might be less mechanically engaging, but it would give the area a unique character that it currently lacks, doubling down on atmosphere over repetitive gameplay. This would also allow the developers to reallocate their time and effort towards fleshing out other underdeveloped areas, like Shifa River or Consecrated Snowfield. Another aspect of the game which could have benefited from subtraction is the music. Elden Ring's boss music is generally well written, well produced, and exciting, but it's also all very similar sounding. Ever since Dark Souls 2, the FromSoft RPGs have become increasingly obsessed with the distinctive Souls sound, a full orchestra with choir and church bells playing together in a disturbing quasi-medieval cacophony, like a Gregorian chant on meth. But that's a glib parody of the highly contrasting music of Dark Souls and Demon Souls. Those games were bombastic and dissonant at times, but many of the tracks cut down on instruments and intensity to give bosses a distinct character, like Nito, Gwendolyn, or Maiden Estrella. It's worth pointing out that the most memorable track from the entire series is played on just 2 pianos. Loud, aggressive music is only effective when contrasted against more intimate music. If every track is equally dramatic, none of them are special. Almost every individual boss track in Elden Ring would stand out as exceptional in Dark Souls or Demon Souls, but together as a whole, the similar orchestration and intensity of these tracks dilutes the impact of any one in particular. A few exceptions stand out, Renala, the Elden Beast, and the Ancestral Spirit, for example, but the vast majority of these tracks are essentially interchangeable. In fact, FromSoft also seemed to think so when they switched the music for Melania and Morgott in the Day 1 patch. Some of the tracks play with the idea of doing something different, like using the organ for Fortisax or the harpsichord for Moog, but in a way this lip service is almost more disappointing. The few tracks which begin in an unusual way are almost always instantly drowned out by the all-too-familiar sound of a wailing choir riding a bed of string staccato and percussion punctuation. It's as if any attempt to be unique is repressed by the need to highlight the spectacle of the boss fight above anything else. Despite the sameness of many boss tracks, at least they all enhance the experience, which is more than I can say for most of the ambient music. Sekiro was the first to introduce consistent ambient music outside of combat to keep up the tension, which made sense for its action-focused gameplay, but otherwise the FromSoft games have avoided ambient music for a good reason. Most video game music is non-diegetic, which means it isn't happening in the game's world, so removing it allows players to get more immersed in the diegetic sounds of that world. Elden Ring abandons that idea, instead filling the world with ambient music tracks. At their best, these tracks add character to each individual area, like in Lendel or Redmane Castle, but even these become tiresome after hearing each short track looped over and over again. Stepping into Limgrave for the first time is a magical experience, and the music adds to the emotional impact of taking in this gorgeous view. But after spending 20 plus hours exploring Limgrave, this 3-minute track will have played hundreds and hundreds of times, turning the music into something more annoying than atmospheric. This is especially true of the tracks with more piercing timbres or obtrusive dissonances, like in Liurnia or Stormvale. Even where the ambient music is more effective in Lendel, it makes no sense to keep the same music once the city has been covered in ash. The intended emotional impact of exploring ash in Lendel is completely different from your first time through it, so using the same distinctive music just seems thoughtless. Overall, the decision to use ambient music was debatable at best. Whatever it adds in atmosphere, it loses something in immersion by covering up the natural sounds of the world, and Elden Ring's considerable playtime makes even the best tracks boring and repetitive. But ambient music is only one way Elden Ring's open world falls short. One of the new mechanics added to accommodate the open world is flask regain. Defeating a complete group of enemies grants a few additional flask usages. In theory, this both aids immersion by allowing players more uninterrupted gameplay, and adds depth to the open world by asking players, is the reward of a few extra flasks worth the risk, or will I lose more in the fight than I hope to gain? Unfortunately, both of these advantages are completely undercut by the ridiculous number of checkpoints in the open world. Sites of Lost Grace are mechanically the same as the bonfires from Dark Souls, but the overly generous helping of them in Elden Ring completely contradicts the purpose of this mechanic. In Dark Souls, bonfires broke up levels into sizable chunks that forced players to carefully consider each drink of Estus and plan accordingly. After my first couple hours of playing Elden Ring, I never once had to think about the costs and benefits of drinking a flask in the open world, because a grace was always bound to appear before I was even remotely close to empty. It's interesting to me that so few people have complained about the number of graces. When Dark Souls 2 and 3 came out, there was a fair amount of backlash from the community about the unnecessary addition of copious bonfires, some of which were so close to each other that there were only a couple enemies or less in between. People argued that this defeats the purpose of bonfires, which it does, but the community has been relatively silent about Elden Ring, which exaggerates this problem to ridiculous proportions. For all the fuss about difficulty and easy modes in these games, Elden Ring's open world is essentially designed in easy mode, because the cost-benefit analysis of using flasks is close to zero. More than half of them could have easily been removed, and this might have also facilitated the clarity of NPC quest lines, because players would be expected to congregate in fewer places. The number of graces, along with the ability to warp from the start, also means that players are incentivized to fast travel all the time, breaking up what should be uninterrupted gameplay into a series of loading screens. Despite the problems with the overabundance of checkpoints, the worst damage done to the open world by far is the inclusion of Torrent, and it's bad enough that I feel confident saying the game would be vastly improved if he was deleted entirely. If you're attached to Torrent, you probably disagree, but I'd ask why you're attached to him in the first place. He's not a character so much as a gameplay mechanic. Comparing him to Aggro from Shadow of the Colossus, the contrast between the two steeds couldn't be more clear. Aggro's delayed handling gives the impression of a real animal responding to suggestions. Aggro won't jump off cliffs because a reasonably smart animal wouldn't do that. If Wander jumps off Aggro, she'll move around autonomously, and in a battle she can get hit by the Colossus and she'll try and run out of the way, again reinforcing that she's an actual character. The lack of other mechanics during the long journeys to each Colossus means the player has nothing to focus on except riding Aggro, strengthening the bond between the two. That bond is paid off when Aggro sacrifices herself for Wander, and her character arc is completed when she heroically returns with an injury at the very end. In contrast, Torrent doesn't exist while you're not using him. He'll obey your controller inputs to the point of death, often despite your own best intentions. He has no autonomy, no personality, and no character development. He might look like an animal, but in reality he's just a button that you press to gain super speed and a double jump. Functionally, he'd be no different if he were a pair of magic boots. But even just considering him as a gameplay mechanic, Torrent is incredibly awkward and unintuitive. As an extension of the player's normal movement, Torrent's stationary jump should have been completely vertical like the player's, but instead he jumps forward, which makes platforming unnecessarily frustrating. Turning 180 degrees triggers a unique animation that rotates Torrent in place, but lesser turns cause him to move forward according to his previous velocity. What this means is that if you're trying to precisely maneuver Torrent while stationary, you'll usually end up walking off a cliff. At full speed, his turns take a wide arc, but if you turn too far, he'll abruptly slam on the brakes and zoom off in the opposite direction. This design is so strange, I honestly have no idea what the intention was, but the effect is to make his handling at any speed incredibly jarring. This is especially true in combat, where even more of the abrupt stops and starts are present because staggering Torrent instantly reduces his speed to 0. The camera never keeps up with Torrent's movement, and adjusting it requires the same thumb used for dashing. All of this is particularly disappointing because the open-world bosses were clearly designed to accommodate both mounted and pedestrian combat, and by trying to do both, it does neither very well. Besides the issues with characterization, handling, and combat, the worst part of Torrent is how destructive he is to engaging with the world. You can now escape from even the slightest threatening situation with the press of a button, and you're practically encouraged to race through the world spamming the dash button without stopping to take any of it in. Any sense of the size or grandeur of the world is instantly minimized by whizzing along through it at breakneck speed. There may not be an easy mode for combat, but Torrent is the easy mode for exploration. Demon Souls and Dark Souls used traps, ambushes, environmental hazards, and enemy placement to encourage a slow, methodical approach to exploration. Rushing in blindly would usually get you killed, whereas you're rewarded for taking the time to carefully explore and develop an awareness of your surroundings. That methodical approach meshed extremely well with the thoughtful map design, environmental storytelling, and detailed artwork characteristic of FromSoft games, giving you more of a chance to take in everything you're seeing. Demon Souls and Dark Souls are enhanced by a slower pace of gameplay, because it gives the player time to think about the world's history, its inhabitants, and the player's own place and path through that world. Unfortunately, that methodical style of gameplay has slowly receded from each successive game. Stamina management is less important, healing is less costly, enemies are more consistently aggressive, combat is more reaction-based, and in a perverse twist of design, attack animations are more and more built around roll catching, input reading, and expected response times, punishing players for being more observant or getting good at previous games. Other changes, like the addition of respecs, changing your appearance, unkillable NPCs, and removing incentives to open yourself to invasions, are also part of the same broad trend. Less deliberate gameplay and less consequence. Respecking might at first sound like a good idea considering the size and difficulty of Elden Ring. Late game bosses can dish out unpredictable attacks with massive damage that will one-shot anyone without enough health. Players aren't expected to understand the value of different stats at first, so it seems reasonable to offer them a chance to rectify their mistakes with the benefit of hindsight, especially if they've already invested 100 hours into a character. There's several problems with this, however. If players are expected to pump more than 20 levels into health at minimum, perhaps the choice shouldn't even be there in the first place. Or at least, it calls into question the design of endgame bosses that force the vast majority of players into choosing a particular way. On the other hand, if the game doesn't communicate the overwhelming value of a particular stat, players shouldn't be punished later on for not choosing it. From this perspective, respecking is an admission from the developers of a flaw in the game's design. Even as a concession, the sheer number of respecs available in a single playthrough is excessive. With 18 accessible larval tiers, many challenges can be easily bypassed with a quick trip to Renala at low cost. If you're having trouble with a boss as a melee build, instead of thinking tactically about position and attack timing, you can simply turn into a glass cannon mage and melt them with a high-level spell, then change back into your melee build for the small price of 2 larval tiers. 1 or 2 available respecs might be considered a safety net, but 18 seems more like an invitation to use a boring gamey menu element to cheese through tough areas. It's curious that the ability to upgrade armor from Dark Souls 1 and 2 never returned in the following games. Besides mediating against an imbalanced distribution of stats, armor upgrades gave players the opportunity to invest in a particular look and build, encouraging them to be more consistent in their roleplay and become more immersed in the world as a result. More than anything, Elden Ring's respecs, along with infinite character customization, work against the feeling of commitment to a unique character that should have been important to a game so focused on the individual experience of every player. If Elden Ring is about having an adventure unique to each person, it's hard to think of anything more contradictory to that idea than the ability to repeatedly change your character's shape, size, sex, and stats at little to no cost. Other newly introduced mechanics aren't as destructive as the copious respecs or Torrent, but many of them aren't well developed either. Spirit ashes are in theory a fun addition that give players more ways to express themselves, but in practice they become cheap tools to take advantage of enemies' inability to deal with multiple opponents. Something to personalize the spirits and endear them to the player was missing here. Besides Mimic Tier and the few spirits that respond to War Cry, there's no way to affect the behavior of spirits once summoned. Some basic AI customization would have gone a long way towards getting players more invested in their spirit. Upgrades could have been improved as well. Instead of collectible upgrades, it wouldn't be too difficult to make spirits upgrade with experience alongside the player, again creating more of a bond between spirit and player. Unlocking specific attacks after sufficient battle experience might take more work to implement, but would also enhance the feeling of investment. Elden Ring's more versatile jumping opens up the world in new ways, which happily the level design often takes advantage of, but in combat it's more of an afterthought. Any attack which is designed to be avoided by jumping can also be avoided by rolling, and the path of least resistance means that it's more convenient to just roll through everything instead of switching back and forth between the two strategies. Removing the ability to roll through these ground attacks would fix this, but enemy ground attacks don't offer players unique offensive opportunities either, so there isn't much depth to the mechanic regardless. Great Runes theoretically incentivize co-op, but rune arcs are abundant offline as well, and besides Melania's rune, none of them fundamentally affect gameplay anyway. Crafting is functional but bare bones. Sleep fills a role missing from the cast of status effects in previous games, but it's overshadowed by other much more useful effects like Bleed and Frost, which even after 6 months of patches are atrociously imbalanced. There's a host of other minor balancing issues which would take hours to fully explore. This isn't surprising given the size of Elden Ring, but maybe it didn't have to be so big in the first place. Whatever it gains in size and scope, it also loses in concision and clarity. It's a game that does a lot of different things, but not all of them are done really well. That doesn't mean that the trade-off wasn't always a good idea, however. Descending into the Schiefer River and realizing that there's a whole world underneath your feet, or watching the map double in size as it zooms out, these are experiences that could only happen because of Elden Ring's size. The feelings of wonder, openness, and freedom that this game provides couldn't be achieved on a smaller scale. If you had to ask me whether the open world was worth it, I'd probably say yes, but with the caveat that I hope this is a one-time thing. I hope it doesn't become the template for future FromSoft games, because it doesn't play to their strengths. The more compact design of Dark Souls and Demon Souls worked in tandem with the slow, methodical gameplay to highlight the best features of both games. Carefully crafted levels, nuanced environmental storytelling, detailed art design, poignant experiences which emerge naturally from gameplay, a commitment to immersion, and an atmosphere which is completely unique. All of those things exist in Elden Ring, but they're more spread out. There's more padding in between, which dilutes the impact of those features and leaves the game feeling somewhat unfocused. The huge amount of content is there to support the overarching vision of a vast open world, but ironically it often just muddies the waters and makes that vision feel less cohesive. FromSoft might continue to make even bigger and more ambitious games in the future, but personally I'd like to see something smaller and simpler. Something that does a little more with a little less.